Alright, here's the thing. When most people think about ancient Chinese philosophy, they immediately jump to Confucius, maybe Laozi, and the Taoists. But there's this absolutely fascinating figure who gets overlooked, and honestly, that's a tragedy. Because Mozi, this guy we're about to explore, he was a philosophical revolutionary who basically said, you know what? Everything you think you know about ethics and society, let's flip it on its head. Look at this subtitle carefully. China's First Consequentialist Thinker. Now that's a loaded phrase. We're talking about someone who, over 2,000 years ago, developed an ethical framework that judges actions based on their outcomes, their consequences, rather than on adherence to tradition or ritual. This is remarkable because in the Western philosophical tradition, we don't see consequentialism fully articulated until Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 18th and 19th centuries. But here's Mozi doing this in ancient China, and he's doing it while actively challenging the dominant Confucian worldview that shaped Chinese civilization. And get this, the subtitle promises we're going to explore the revolutionary ideas of a forgotten sage who challenged the foundations of Chinese thought and championed universal love for all humanity. Universal love, in the Warring States period, when everyone was literally at war with everyone else. Talk about reading the room, right? But that's exactly what makes Mozi so compelling. He looked at a world tearing itself apart and said, I've got a better idea. And that idea, that we should care equally for all human beings, not just our own families and tribes, that's an idea that still challenges us today. Let's ground ourselves in the historical reality here. Mozi lived during what we call the Warring States period, approximately 470 to 391 BCE. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to picture China at this moment in history. The Zhou dynasty's central authority had collapsed. What had been a unified kingdom had fractured into multiple competing states, each vying for dominance. And I mean, competing. This wasn't just political rivalry. This was constant warfare, shifting alliances, betrayal, conquest. It was brutal. But here's what's remarkable about chaos. It creates space for radical thinking. When the old order breaks down, suddenly all the assumptions that held society together are up for grabs. And this is exactly what happened. The Warring States period became one of the most philosophically fertile moments in human history, what we call the 100 schools of thought. Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, and yes, Mohism, all emerging simultaneously, all offering competing visions of how to fix a broken world. Now, Mozi's background is fascinating. The slide tells us he was originally trained in Confucian traditions. Think about that for a moment. He wasn't some outsider throwing stones at the establishment. He was an insider. He knew the Confucian classics, understood the rituals, could quote the texts, and then he rejected it, boldly, completely. The slide mentions that he rejected Confucianism's emphasis on ritualism and partiality towards one's own family. This is crucial. Confucianism built its entire ethical system on the idea of graded love. You owe more to your parents than to strangers, more to your family than to outsiders. It's hierarchical, it's structured, and Confucius thought this was natural and right. Mozi said, no, that's exactly the problem. But here's what I love about Mozi. He wasn't just a philosopher sitting in an ivory tower. Look at what the slide tells us. A man of remarkable versatility, Mozi was both a skilled craftsman and military engineer who served as a government minister. This guy could build things. He understood engineering, military defense, practical governance. His philosophical outlook was informed by real-world expertise. When he talked about how society should work, he wasn't theorizing. He was speaking from experience about what actually works and what doesn't. You know how sometimes you meet someone who's both brilliant intellectually and practically competent? Like, they can discuss abstract philosophy and fix your car? That's Mozi. Except instead of your car, he's building defensive fortifications and reforming government policy. The slide ends by noting that Mohism became a major school of thought that would rival both Confucianism and Taoism in influence and scope. Let that sink in. We're not talking about some minor philosophical footnote. At its height, Mohism was one of the dominant intellectual forces in China. It had organized followers, it influenced policy, it shaped debates. The fact that most people today have never heard of it, that's a story we'll get to. The story of how a major philosophical tradition can be almost erased from history. But for now, what you need to understand is this. Mozi took his practical expertise, his deep knowledge of Confucian tradition, and his experience of a world at war, and he synthesized something entirely new. Something that would challenge the very foundations of Chinese thought, and that's where we're headed next, into the radical core of Mohist philosophy. Because if you think rejecting Confucianism was bold, wait until you hear what Mozi proposed to replace it with. Okay, so we've set the stage. China's falling apart, warfare everywhere, competing philosophies battling for influence. And here comes Mozi with an idea so radical, so fundamentally challenging to the social order, that even today it makes people uncomfortable. Universal love. Jian'ai in Chinese. Now, before your eyes glaze over thinking, oh, another philosopher talking about love, let me tell you why this is genuinely revolutionary. Look at the first point on this slide. Impartial care. Equal concern for all people, transcending family and social boundaries. Think about what this means. Mozi is saying that the stranger on the street deserves the same moral consideration as your own mother. The person in a distant land you'll never meet has the same claim on your concern as your own child. In ancient China, hell, in most of human history, this is insane. It goes against everything we think of as natural human psychology. The second point makes this even clearer. Opposing partiality. Challenged Confucian filial piety that favored family over strangers. Now we need to understand what Mozi was up against here. Confucian filial piety, jiao, wasn't just a nice idea about respecting your parents. It was the absolute bedrock of the entire social system. The family was the model for all relationships. The emperor was the father of the nation. Social harmony came from everyone knowing their place in these nested hierarchies. And Mozi walks in and says, this is the root of the problem. Picture this. You're a Confucian scholar, and you've spent your whole life studying the classics, learning the rituals, teaching people that the path to social harmony is through proper relationships, respecting your elders, honoring your ancestors, maintaining the hierarchies. And here's this guy saying, actually, that's exactly what's causing all the warfare and chaos. His argument goes like this. When everyone prioritizes their own family, their own state, their own group, what happens? You get factionalism, you get tribalism, my family against your family, my state against your state, and that leads directly to conflict, to war, to the suffering we see everywhere. The third point captures Mozi's solution. Social harmony, believed equal love for all would eliminate disorder and factionalism. This isn't just wishful thinking. Mozi has a sophisticated argument here. He's saying that social disorder arises from partiality, from the fact that we care more about our people than their people. If everyone cared equally for everyone else, there would be no motivation for aggression, no reason for one state to attack another, no basis for the kind of factional violence tearing China apart. Now I know what you're thinking. Professor, this is completely unrealistic. Human beings are wired to care more about their own families. This is evolutionary psychology 101. Mozi's living in a fantasy world. And look, that's a fair objection. We'll come back to it. But here's the thing. Mozi knew this objection too. He wasn't naive. He was making a normative claim, not a descriptive one. He wasn't saying people naturally love everyone equally. He was saying people should love everyone equally, and here's why it would solve our problems. Look at that final note at the bottom of the slide. Mozi's concept of universal love was revolutionary. He argued that social harmony arises naturally when everyone treats others with equal care and concern, regardless of their relationship or social standing. Naturally, that's the key word. Not through elaborate rituals. Not through enforcing hierarchies. Not through everyone knowing their place. But through a fundamental reorientation of how we think about our moral obligations to other human beings. This is consequentialist ethics in action. Judge the system by its outcomes. Does Confucian partiality lead to harmony? No. Look around at the warfare. Would universal impartial care lead to harmony? Mozi argues yes, and he's willing to stake his entire philosophical system on that claim. Now we're getting into the real philosophical machinery of Mohism. This slide reveals how Mozi constructs his ethical framework, and I want you to pay close attention because this is sophisticated stuff. Ethics through outcomes. That's our headline. And the explanation is crucial. Mozi developed a sophisticated ethical framework that judged actions by their consequences rather than intentions or adherence to ritual. Let me break down why this is such a departure from Confucianism. In Confucian ethics, what matters is whether you're following the proper rituals, maintaining the proper relationships, cultivating the proper virtues. The focus is on the agent. Are you becoming a junzi, a superior person? Are you performing the rites correctly? Mozi says, I don't care about any of that. What I care about is, does your action benefit society or harm it? Does it increase human welfare or decrease it? That's the only question that matters. This is a complete inversion of ethical priorities. And notice what the slide says. What matters most is whether an action benefits society as a whole. Society as a whole. Not your family, not your state, not your social class, the collective welfare of all people. Now here's where it gets interesting. The slide introduces heaven, Tian in Chinese, and describes it as an impartial moral agent, rewarding virtue and punishing wrongdoing without favor or bias. We need to be careful here. This isn't the personal God of Western monotheism. This is more like an impersonal cosmic moral order. Think of it as the universe itself having a moral structure, and that structure is impartial. Why does Mozi need heaven in his system? Because he needs an objective grounding for his ethics. He can't just say, I think universal love is good. He needs to show that it's objectively, cosmically, fundamentally right. And heaven provides that grounding. Heaven doesn't care if you're an emperor or a peasant. Heaven doesn't care if you're from the state of Qi or the state of Chu. Heaven judges everyone by the same standard. Do your actions promote human welfare? Look at that final point. Moral standards derive from what promotes collective welfare and social order. A utilitarian framework that was revolutionary in ancient Chinese thought. Utilitarian. That word should jump out at you. We're talking about the greatest good for the greatest number, centuries before Bentham coined the phrase. Mozi is doing consequentialist ethics, sophisticated, rigorous consequentialist ethics, in ancient China. You know what's wild? In Western philosophy courses, we teach utilitarianism as this modern Enlightenment era development. Bentham in the 1700s, Mill in the 1800s, that's when consequentialism supposedly gets invented. Meanwhile, Mozi's over here in 400 BCE going, yeah, I figured this out already, where have you guys been? But here's what makes Mozi's version particularly interesting. Western utilitarianism tends to be secular. It doesn't need God or cosmic order. Mozi, on the other hand, grounds his consequentialism in heaven. The reason we should promote collective welfare isn't just because it's pragmatically useful. It's because that's the moral structure of reality itself. Heaven wants human flourishing. Heaven rewards those who promote it and punishes those who harm it. Therefore, the rational thing to do, the thing that aligns with the fundamental nature of the universe, is to act in ways that benefit everyone equally. Think about the power of this framework. Mozi can now argue against Confucian ritual on consequentialist grounds. Do elaborate funeral ceremonies benefit society? No, they waste resources. Do expensive musical performances promote collective welfare? No, they're luxuries the state can't afford during wartime. Does aggressive warfare benefit humanity? Obviously not. Every practice, every tradition, every social norm, Mozi subjects it all to one test. Does it promote human welfare? If yes, keep it. If no, discard it, no matter how ancient or revered. And this is where Mozi becomes genuinely dangerous to the established order. Because once you accept that consequences matter more than tradition, that human welfare matters more than ritual propriety, that heaven judges everyone by the same impartial standard, well, suddenly all those hierarchies and privileges and traditional practices need to justify themselves. And a lot of them can't. So we've got universal love, the radical claim that everyone deserves equal moral consideration. And we've got consequentialism, the framework that judges everything by its outcomes for collective human welfare. Put those together, and you've got a philosophical system that challenges the very foundations of traditional Chinese society. No wonder the Confucians fought back so hard. No wonder Mohism became both incredibly influential and incredibly controversial, and we're just getting started. Because Mozi didn't just theorize. He built an entire system of 10 core doctrines, each one designed to translate these abstract principles into concrete social reform. That's where we're headed next. Alright, so we've established the philosophical foundation, universal love, consequentialist ethics, heaven as the impartial moral standard. Beautiful theory, right? But here's what separates Mozi from armchair philosophers. He didn't stop at theory. He said, okay, if we actually believe this stuff, what does it mean for how we organize society? And he gave us 10 concrete answers. Look at this slide. Mozi's philosophical system was built upon 10 interconnected principles, each designed to promote practical social reform and address the excesses of contemporary society. Interconnected. That's the key word. These aren't just random policy proposals. Each doctrine flows from the core principles we've discussed, and each one targets a specific problem Mozi saw in warring states China. Let's start with number 1. Exaltation of the virtuous, promoting meritocracy over inherited status. Now, remember the context. Ancient China was deeply hierarchical. Your social position was determined by birth. If you were born into the aristocracy, you got power and privilege. If you were born a peasant, tough luck. Confucianism actually reinforced this. Know your place, respect your betters, maintain the social order. Mozi says, that's idiotic. His argument is pure consequentialism. If you want a well-governed society, you need competent people in positions of authority. Does competence correlate with noble birth? Obviously not. So why are we giving power to people based on who their parents were instead of what they can actually do? Exalt the virtuous. Promote based on merit. Put the skilled craftsman in charge of building projects, the wise strategist in charge of defense, the capable administrator in charge of governance. Judge people by their abilities and their contributions to collective welfare, not by their bloodline. This is revolutionary stuff. This is attacking the entire basis of aristocratic privilege. Number 2, condemnation of offensive war. Opposing aggression while supporting defensive aid. This one's fascinating because Mozi isn't a pacifist. He's not saying all war is wrong. He's making a distinction between aggressive warfare and defensive assistance. Think about it consequentially. Does offensive war benefit humanity? No. It destroys resources, kills people, creates suffering, destabilizes society. It's a net negative for collective welfare. Therefore, it's morally wrong and heaven condemns it. But what about defending yourself when attacked? What about helping a small state that's being invaded by a larger aggressor? That does promote collective welfare. It protects the innocent, deters future aggression, maintains stability. And remember, Mozi wasn't just theorizing about this. He was a military engineer. There are stories of him literally traveling to states under threat and helping them build defensive fortifications. He'd show up and say, "I hear you're about to get invaded. Let me show you how to build walls that'll make the attackers think twice." Philosophy meets engineering. That's Mozi in action. Number 3, economy and expenditures. Advocating frugality in governance and daily life. Again, pure consequentialism. Does lavish government spending benefit society? Does it promote collective welfare? Or does it waste resources that could be used to feed the hungry, defend the vulnerable, improve people's lives? Mozi looked at the extravagant courts of the warring states period and said, "This is obscene. Cut it out." Number 4, simplicity in funerals. Rejecting elaborate burial ceremonies as wasteful. Now this one got him in serious trouble with the Confucians, because elaborate funeral rites were central to Confucian practice. 3 years of mourning, expensive ceremonies, elaborate tombs. This was how you showed filial piety. Mozi said, "You know what doesn't help dead people? Expensive funerals. You know what does help living people? Not bankrupting families with funeral costs?" Number 5, denunciation of music. Viewing musical performances as resource-draining luxury. Okay, this is where even Mozi's admirers start to get uncomfortable. Music? Really? You're going after music? But look at his reasoning. In a time of war and famine, when resources are scarce and people are suffering, is it morally justifiable to spend enormous amounts of money on court musicians and elaborate performances? Consequentially, does that promote collective welfare? Mozi says no, and he's willing to be unpopular about it. Now, I'm not saying I agree with him on this one. I like music. You probably like music. But you've got to respect the consistency. He's not picking and choosing which luxuries to condemn based on what he personally enjoys. He's applying his principle ruthlessly. Does it benefit society? If not, it's got to go. That's intellectual honesty, even when it leads to uncomfortable conclusions. Number 6, anti-fatalism, rejecting determinism and affirming human agency. This is philosophically crucial. There was a strain of thought in ancient China that said everything is fated, predetermined. What will be, so why bother trying to change things? Mozi absolutely rejects this. Why? Because fatalism undermines moral responsibility and social reform. If everything's predetermined, why work for justice? Why try to improve society? Why promote universal love? Mozi needs human agency. His entire system depends on people being able to choose to act differently, to embrace universal love, to promote collective welfare. Fatalism is incompatible with moral reform, so he argues, heaven wants human flourishing, but humans have to choose it. We have agency, we have responsibility, and that means we can change things. Okay, now we're getting into something really cool, because Mozi wasn't just an ethical philosopher and social reformer. The Mohists developed one of the most sophisticated logical systems in ancient China. Look at this slide title, Mohist Logic and Epistemology. We're talking about how they thought about thinking itself. The first section says pioneers of formal logic, and notes that the Mohists were among early China's most sophisticated logicians, developing rigorous methods of argumentation and reasoning that paralleled developments in ancient Greece. Let that sink in. While Aristotle was developing syllogistic logic in Greece, the Mohists were independently developing formal logical systems in China. Different cultures, different languages, arriving at similar insights about the structure of valid reasoning. The slide gives us three key elements of Mohist logic. First, emphasized clear distinctions between shi, rightness, and fei, wrongness. This is about precision. The Mohists insisted on clearly defining terms and making explicit distinctions. You can't have productive philosophical debate if everyone's using words differently. So they developed rigorous methods for clarifying concepts. Second, developed analogical reasoning techniques. Analogical reasoning, arguing from similarity. This situation is like that situation, so what applies there should apply here. The Mohists formalize this, showing when analogies are valid and when they break down. And this connects directly to their ethical project. Remember universal love? That's based on analogical reasoning. Just as you care about your own welfare, you should care about others' welfare. Just as you want others to help you, you should help them. Third, created pragmatic language theory. Pragmatic. There's that word again. The Mohists weren't interested in logic for its own sake. They wanted logic that worked, that helped people reason correctly about real moral and political questions. Language for them was a tool, and like any tool, it needed to be used precisely and effectively. Sloppy language leads to sloppy thinking, which leads to bad policy, which leads to human suffering. Now look at the second section, knowledge as skillful ability. This is where Mohist epistemology gets really interesting. The slide explains. For Mohists, knowledge wasn't merely theoretical understanding. It was the practical ability to discern moral truths and apply them effectively to real-world situations. Think about what this means. In Western philosophy, we often separate theoretical knowledge from practical skill. You can know something in the abstract without being able to do anything with that knowledge. The Mohists reject this separation. Real knowledge is demonstrated through action. You don't truly understand carpentry until you can build a table. You don't truly understand ethics until you can make correct moral judgments in complex situations. And look at that final note. This emphasis on practical epistemology reflected Mozi's background as a craftsman and engineer. There it is again. Mozi the craftsman, Mozi the engineer. He knew that theoretical knowledge without practical application is worthless. A blueprint for a bridge doesn't matter if you can't actually build the bridge. You know how sometimes you meet someone who's read every philosophy book but can't actually reason their way through a real moral dilemma? Or someone who can quote ethical theories but makes terrible decisions in their own life? The Mohists would say, that person doesn't actually have knowledge. They have information, maybe, but not knowledge. Knowledge is the ability to do the thing correctly, to reason validly, to make sound moral judgments, to build functioning social institutions. This epistemological framework supports everything else in Mohism. You can't just theoretically accept universal love. You have to be able to practice it. You can't just understand consequentialism abstractly. You have to be able to apply it to real policy questions. The Mohists were training people not just to think correctly, but to act correctly. Logic wasn't an academic exercise. It was a tool for social reform. And this is what makes the Mohist intellectual project so remarkable. They're not just proposing ethical principles. They're not just advocating policy reforms. They're building the entire intellectual infrastructure needed to support those reforms. They're saying, here's what's right. Universal love, collective welfare. Here's how to think about it. Consequentialist ethics. Here's how to reason about it. Formal logic. Here's how to know if you've got it. Practical application. It's a complete system. Ethics, politics, logic, epistemology, all integrated, all pointing toward the same goal, reducing human suffering and promoting collective flourishing. Now you might be thinking, this sounds pretty good. Sophisticated ethics, rigorous logic, practical focus. Why isn't Mohism as famous as Confucianism? Well, that's exactly what we need to talk about next. Because Mohism didn't just have philosophical rivals, it had enemies, and the clash between Mohism and Confucianism, that's one of the great intellectual battles in Chinese history. And spoiler alert, Confucianism won. But the reasons why are more complicated than you might think. All right, here we go. This is the showdown, the philosophical heavyweight championship of ancient China. In one corner, we have Confucianism, the establishment, the tradition, the philosophy that would eventually dominate Chinese thought for 2 millennia. In the other corner, we have Mohism, the challenger, the revolutionary, the philosophy that said, everything you believe is wrong. And this wasn't just academic debate. This was a fight over the soul of Chinese civilization. Look at this slide. It's set up as a direct comparison, and I want you to see how fundamentally opposed these systems are. This isn't a disagreement over details. This is a clash of completely different worldviews. Let's start with the first contrast. Confucianism. Virtue ethics centered on character cultivation. Mohism. Objective moral standards based on outcomes. This is the heart of the difference. Confucianism asks, what kind of person should I become? The focus is on cultivating virtues, benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom. Become a yunzi, a superior person, and right action will follow naturally from your character. Mozi says, I don't care about your character, I care about what you do and what results from it. For Confucians, ethics is about internal cultivation. For Mohists, ethics is about external consequences. A Confucian might say, I acted from benevolence. A Mohist would respond, but did it help anyone? Did it reduce suffering? Did it promote collective welfare? These are fundamentally incompatible approaches to ethics. Next contrast. Confucianism. Hierarchical social roles and relationships. Mohism. Impartial care for all humanity equally. This is where things get personal. Because Confucianism isn't just proposing hierarchy as a political structure, it's saying hierarchy is natural, proper, and morally necessary. Father over son, husband over wife, ruler over subject, elder over younger. Each relationship has defined roles, defined obligations. And these aren't equal relationships. They're hierarchical by design. Mozi looks at this and says, this is the problem. This is exactly what's causing all the warfare and suffering. When you teach people that some humans matter more than others, when you build morality on partiality and favoritism, you get factionalism, you get tribalism, you get war. Third contrast. Confucianism. Ritual propriety and elaborate ceremonies. Mohism. Consequentialist ethical framework. Now, we've touched on this before, but let's really dig into what's at stake here. For Confucians, ritual li is absolutely central. The elaborate ceremonies, the precise gestures, the formal protocols, these aren't just traditions. They're how you cultivate virtue, maintain social harmony, connect with the past. Mozi's response is devastating in its simplicity. Does it work? Does all this ritual actually create harmony? Does it reduce suffering? Does it promote collective welfare? And when he looks at the Warring States period, constant warfare, massive suffering, social chaos, his answer is clear. No. It doesn't work, so stop doing it. Fourth contrast, and this is the one that really got the Confucians angry. Confucianism. Family partiality as moral foundation. Mohism. Frugality over ceremonial extravagance. Wait, those don't seem to match up exactly, do they? Let me explain the connection. Confucian family partiality expresses itself most clearly in elaborate funeral rites. 3 years of mourning for your parents. Expensive ceremonies, elaborate tombs. This is how you demonstrate filial piety. the absolute bedrock of Confucian ethics. And Mozi says, this is wasteful, destructive, and morally wrong. Can you imagine how that landed? Mozi is attacking filial piety itself, the most sacred principle in Confucian thought. He's saying that bankrupting your family to honor dead parents doesn't help anyone. The dead don't benefit. The living suffer. Resources are wasted that could feed the hungry or defend the vulnerable. I mean, talk about picking a fight. That's like walking into a room full of people and saying, you know what? Your most deeply held value, the thing you've built your entire moral system around, yeah, that's garbage. Bold move, Mozi. Bold move. But here's what the slide emphasizes at the bottom. Mozi directly challenged Confucian priorities, criticizing elaborate rituals as wasteful and arguing that family partiality led to social division. This isn't just policy disagreement. This is a fundamental challenge to the Confucian worldview. Because if Mozi is right, if family partiality does lead to social division, if ritual is wasteful, if hierarchy causes conflict, then the entire Confucian project is built on a mistake. The final note is crucial. Mohists actively opposed offensive warfare whilst promoting defensive military assistance to vulnerable states. This is where Mohist philosophy becomes Mohist action. They didn't just argue against aggressive war. They actively intervened to stop it. They provided military aid to states under threat. They built defensive fortifications. They put their lives on the line for their principles. The Confucians could dismiss this as naive idealism, but the Mohists could point to actual results. States defended, lives saved, aggression deterred. Their consequentialism wasn't just theory, it was tested in the real world. So we've seen the philosophical battle. Now let's talk about what Mohism actually accomplished, because this wasn't just an intellectual movement, it was a social and political force that shaped Chinese history. Look at the first item. Paramilitary communities. Mohist groups acted as organized defenders, providing military aid to small states under threat. Paramilitary communities. Let that sink in. The Mohists weren't just philosophers sitting around debating ethics, they were organized, disciplined groups with military training and defensive expertise. Imagine this. You're a small state, and a larger aggressive neighbor is threatening invasion. You're outmatched, outgunned, probably doomed. And then a group of Mohists shows up. They're skilled engineers who can build fortifications. They're trained in defensive tactics. They're committed to the principle that aggressive warfare is morally wrong and must be opposed. And they're willing to risk their lives to defend you. This is philosophy in action. This is what it looks like when you take universal love and consequentialist ethics seriously. You don't just write treatises about defending the vulnerable, you actually do it. There are historical accounts of Mozi himself traveling to states under threat, personally organizing their defense, sometimes successfully deterring invasion just by his presence and reputation. Second item, meritocratic advocacy, championed honoring the worthy regardless of birth or social status. Now, we discuss this as one of the 10 doctrines, but look at the impact. The Mohists weren't just proposing meritocracy as an abstract ideal. They were actively challenging aristocratic privilege. In their own communities, they practiced what they preached. Leadership positions went to the most capable, not the most well-born. Decisions were made based on expertise, not social rank. This was radical social organization for ancient China, and it worked. Mohist communities were known for their discipline, their effectiveness, their ability to accomplish difficult tasks. When you actually put competent people in charge instead of aristocrats, turns out things run better. Who knew? The aristocrats knew, actually. They knew perfectly well. That's why they hated this idea so much. Nothing threatens inherited privilege quite like the suggestion that maybe, just maybe, privilege should be earned rather than inherited. Third item, policy influence, shaped early Qin and Han Dynasty governance despite later philosophical decline. This is fascinating. Even after Mohism faded as a distinct school of thought, its ideas continued to influence Chinese governance. The Qin dynasty's emphasis on meritocracy, its pragmatic approach to administration, its focus on practical outcomes, these all show Mohist influence. The Han Dynasty, which eventually adopted Confucianism as state ideology, still incorporated Mohist elements. The examination system that selected officials based on merit rather than birth, that's got Mohist DNA in it. The emphasis on practical administration over ritual propriety? Mohist influence. So here's the paradox. Mohism, as a school of thought, largely disappeared after the Qin unification. The organized Mohist communities dissolved. The texts were partially lost. For centuries, Mozi was almost forgotten. But the ideas survived. They got absorbed, transformed, integrated into other systems, sometimes without anyone even recognizing their Mohist origins. Fourth item, lasting legacy, left enduring impact on Chinese thought even after Mohism faded following Qin unification. Let's talk about why Mohism faded, because this is important for understanding both its impact and its limitations. The Qin dynasty unified China through brutal conquest and authoritarian rule. They burned books, suppressed dissent, enforced ideological conformity. Mohism, with its organized communities and independent power base, was seen as a threat. The Mohist organizations were dismantled. Then the Han dynasty came to power and made Confucianism the official state ideology. Not because Confucianism was philosophically superior, but because it was politically useful. Confucian hierarchy supported imperial authority. Confucian ritual legitimized the emperor. Confucian family values created stable, obedient subjects. Mohism, with its universal love that transcends loyalty to rulers, its meritocracy that challenges inherited status, its consequentialism that questions traditional authority, this was dangerous to imperial power. So Mohism was suppressed, marginalized, eventually almost forgotten. Not because it lost the philosophical argument, but because it lost the political struggle. You know what's darkly funny? The Confucians won by doing exactly what Mozi said they would do, prioritizing their own group's interests over universal welfare. Confucianism served the interests of the ruling class, so the ruling class promoted Confucianism, consequentialism in action, just not the kind Mozi hoped for. But here's what we need to recognize. Even in defeat, Mohism changed Chinese thought permanently. The idea that ethics should have practical consequences? That survived. The critique of wasteful ritual? That survived. The emphasis on meritocracy? That survived. The opposition to aggressive warfare? That survived, at least as an ideal. Mohism didn't win the battle for dominance. Confucianism did. But Mohism won something else. It expanded the boundaries of what Chinese philosophy could be. It showed that you could challenge the most fundamental assumptions of society and build a coherent alternative. It proved that universal love wasn't just a naive dream, it was a principle worth organizing your life around, worth risking your life for. And even though the Mohist communities disappeared, even though the texts were partially lost, even though Mozi himself was largely forgotten for centuries, the questions Mohism raised never went away. Can we build a society on impartial care rather than partiality? Should we judge traditions by their consequences rather than their antiquity? Does competence matter more than birth? Can philosophy change the world? These are Mohist questions, and there still are questions today. That's the real legacy. Not institutional survival, but the permanent expansion of philosophical possibility. Okay, so we've spent all this time exploring ancient Chinese philosophy, a guy who lived 2,400 years ago, whose school of thought largely disappeared, whose texts were partially lost. You might be thinking, Professor, this is fascinating history, but why does it matter now? What does Mozi have to say to us in the 21st century? I'm so glad you asked. Because here's the thing. Mozi isn't just historically important. He's urgently relevant to the problems we face right now. Look at the first box. Universal human concern. Early advocate of impartial ethics that transcends tribal and national boundaries. Think about our world right now. We live in an era of resurgent nationalism, tribal politics, identity-based conflict. My country first. My group versus your group. My tribe's interests over everyone else's. And here's Mozi, 2,400 years ago, saying, this is the problem. This partiality, this tribalism, this prioritizing your own group, this is what causes conflict, suffering, and war. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because we're living through exactly what Mozi diagnosed. We're watching family partiality scaled up to national partiality, watching group loyalty become factional warfare, watching the inability to care equally for all humans tear our world apart. Mozi's question to us is simple and devastating. Can you care about a refugee family as much as your own family? Can you care about climate change victims on the other side of the world as much as people in your own country? Can you extend moral consideration equally to all human beings? Most of us would say, well, that's unrealistic. That's not how humans work. And Mozi would respond, I know. That's why your world is falling apart. That's why you have endless conflict. Because you've built your ethics on partiality instead of universal concern. Second box, consequentialist ethics. Anticipated modern utilitarian philosophy by over 2 millennia. Here's what's remarkable. We teach ethics courses where we present consequentialism as this modern development. Bentham in the 1780s, Mill in the 1860s, that's when we supposedly figured out that consequences matter. But Mozi was doing sophisticated consequentialist ethics in the 5th century BCE. He was asking, does this action promote collective welfare? Does it reduce suffering? Does it benefit humanity as a whole? And he was applying this framework systematically to social policy, warfare, governance, ritual, everything. Why does this matter? Because it shows us that consequentialism isn't just a Western Enlightenment idea. It's a human insight that can emerge independently in different cultures. It's a way of thinking about ethics that transcends cultural boundaries. And that means when we're debating ethical frameworks today, when we're arguing about how to address climate change or global poverty or pandemic response, we can draw on a much richer philosophical tradition than we usually recognize. Third box, non-Western perspective, offers unique insights into morality, logic, and governance outside Western traditions. This is crucial, and I want you to really hear this. Western philosophy has dominated global academic discourse for centuries. When we teach ethics, we teach Aristotle, Kant, Mill. When we teach logic, we teach Aristotle and formal symbolic logic. When we teach political philosophy, we teach Plato, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. And there's nothing wrong with those thinkers. They're brilliant, but they're not the only game in town. They're not the only humans who've thought deeply about ethics, logic, and governance. Mozi offers us a completely different philosophical lineage. He shows us that you can develop sophisticated consequentialism without going through Bentham. You can develop formal logic without going through Aristotle. You can critique hierarchy and advocate meritocracy without going through Enlightenment liberalism. This matters because philosophical diversity isn't just nice to have. It's essential. Different cultural contexts produce different insights. Different historical challenges generate different solutions. When we limit ourselves to one philosophical tradition, we impoverish our thinking. Mozi expands our philosophical toolkit. He gives us new ways to think about old problems. And in a globalized world facing unprecedented challenges, we need every tool we can get. Fourth box, contemporary relevance, inspires modern debates on ethics, social justice, peace, and global cooperation. Let's get specific about this. Where do we see Mohist ideas showing up in contemporary debates? Global justice. Peter Singer's arguments about our obligations to distant strangers, about effective altruism, about impartial consideration of interests. These are fundamentally Mohist arguments. Singer might not cite Mozi, but he's working in the same tradition. Just war theory, the distinction between aggressive warfare and defensive intervention, the emphasis on protecting the vulnerable, the consequentialist calculation of harm versus benefit. Mozi was doing this 2,400 years before modern just war theorists. Meritocracy debates. When we argue about affirmative action, legacy admissions, inherited wealth, we're wrestling with the same question Mozi asked. Should positions and resources go to those who deserve them based on ability and contribution, or to those who inherit privilege? And peace. God, the question of peace. Mozi looked at a world at war and said, universal love is the answer. When everyone cares equally for everyone else, warfare becomes impossible. We might think that's naive. But is it? Or have we just never seriously tried it? What if Mozi is right? What if the reason we can't achieve lasting peace isn't because it's impossible, but because we refuse to abandon partiality? What if our tribalism, our nationalism, our group loyalties? What if these are the problem, not the solution? Alright, we've reached the end of our journey through Mohist philosophy, and this final slide distills everything we've discussed into 4 essential points. Think of these as Mozi's challenge to us, his invitation to reimagine how we organize society and relate to one another. A call to action, impartial love, practical ethics, and social order grounded in reason rather than ritual. This is the heart of it. Mozi isn't offering us a contemplative philosophy, something to think about in quiet moments. He's issuing a call to action. He's saying, "The world is broken. Here's how to fix it. Impartial love. Extend equal moral consideration to all human beings. Practical ethics. Judge actions by their consequences for collective welfare. Social order grounded in reason. Organize society based on what actually works, not on tradition or ritual. This is revolutionary. This is saying that we can deliberately construct a better world using reason and evidence. We don't have to accept things as they are. We don't have to defer to tradition. We can ask, does this promote human flourishing? If not, change it. That's empowering and terrifying in equal measure, because it means we're responsible. We can't hide behind that's just how things are, or that's what we've always done. If we know better, we have to do better. A philosophical challenge, rethinking partiality and examining the true foundations of moral action. This is where Mozi gets uncomfortable. Because he's not just proposing new ideas, he's challenging our deepest assumptions. We assume it's natural and right to care more about our own families. Mozi says, examine that assumption. Is it actually morally justified, or is it just evolutionary psychology masquerading as ethics? We assume that loyalty to our own group is a virtue. Mozi says, is it, or is that loyalty the root of conflict and suffering? We assume that following tradition is generally good. Mozi says, why? What if the tradition is harmful? What if it doesn't promote collective welfare? These are hard questions. They're meant to be hard, because Mozi is asking us to examine the very foundations of how we think about morality. And here's the thing. You might disagree with his answers. You might think family partiality is justified, that group loyalty is virtuous, that tradition has value beyond its consequences. That's fine. But you need to have reasons. You need to be able to defend those positions, not just assume them. That's the philosophical challenge. Not to accept Mozi's conclusions necessarily, but to think as rigorously as he did about the foundations of ethics. A lasting alternative. Powerful counter-tradition to ritualistic and hierarchical philosophical systems. Think about what this means. For most of human history, most philosophical and religious systems have been hierarchical. They've assumed that some people are naturally superior to others, that social rank reflects moral worth, that elaborate rituals and traditions are essential to social order. Confucianism says this. Hinduism's caste system says this. Medieval European feudalism said this. Even modern systems often assume hierarchy is natural and necessary. Mozi stands as a permanent alternative to all of that. He shows us that you can build a coherent, sophisticated philosophical system on completely different foundations. You can ground ethics in equality rather than hierarchy. You can base social order on reason rather than ritual. You can prioritize consequences over tradition. And the fact that this alternative exists, that it was developed independently in ancient China, that it rivaled Confucianism for centuries, this proves that hierarchical, ritualistic systems aren't inevitable. They're choices, and we can choose differently. An invitation to change, pursuing a fairer, more caring society that extends compassion to all humanity. An invitation, not a command, not a dogma, an invitation. Mozi is inviting us to imagine a different kind of world, a world where we care about strangers as much as family, where we judge people by their abilities and contributions rather than their birth, where we organize society to promote collective welfare rather than to maintain traditional hierarchies, where we oppose aggression and defend the vulnerable. Is this realistic? Maybe not. Probably not. Human psychology might make it impossible. Political realities might prevent it. The weight of tradition might be too heavy to overcome. But here's what Mozi would say. So what? Does that mean we shouldn't try? Does that mean we should just accept a world of tribalism, warfare, and suffering because change is hard? The invitation to change isn't an invitation to achieve perfection. It's an invitation to try, to move in the direction of universal love, even if we never fully get there, to apply consequentialist thinking, even when it's difficult, to challenge hierarchy, even when it's entrenched, to choose reason over ritual, even when tradition is comfortable. You know what's remarkable? Mozi issued this invitation 2,400 years ago. His school of thought was suppressed. His texts were partially lost. He was largely forgotten for centuries. And yet here we are, still wrestling with his questions, still challenged by his vision, still invited to imagine a world organized around universal love and collective welfare. That's the power of a truly radical idea. It doesn't die. It can be suppressed, marginalized, forgotten, but it keeps coming back. Because it addresses something fundamental about the human condition. It speaks to our deepest hopes about what we could be, even as it challenges our deepest assumptions about what we are. So here's what I want you to take away from our exploration of Mozi. First, that consequentialism, the idea that we should judge actions by their outcomes, isn't just a modern Western invention. It's a human insight that can emerge anywhere, anytime people think seriously about ethics. Second, that universal love, impartial concern for all human beings, isn't just naive idealism. It's a serious philosophical position with sophisticated arguments behind it. You can disagree with it, but you need to engage with those arguments. Third, that philosophical diversity matters. Mozi shows us that there are multiple ways to think about ethics, logic, and governance. We impoverish ourselves when we limit our philosophical resources to one tradition. And finally, that philosophy isn't just about understanding the world, it's about changing it. Mozi didn't just theorize about universal love, he organized communities around it. He didn't just argue against aggressive warfare. He actively defended vulnerable states. He didn't just critique ritual, he proposed concrete alternatives. That's philosophy in action. That's what it looks like when you take ideas seriously enough to stake your life on them. So Mozi's question to us, across 2,400 years, is simple. What are you willing to stake your life on? What ideas matter enough to organize your life around? Can you extend your moral concern beyond your tribe, your nation, your group? Can you judge traditions by whether they actually promote human welfare? Can you imagine a world organized around universal love? You might answer no to all of those questions. That's your choice. But at least Mozi has forced you to ask them. At least he's shown you that there's an alternative to the way things are. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe the invitation to change doesn't require acceptance. Maybe it just requires consideration. Maybe the lasting legacy of a forgotten philosopher is simply this: the permanent expansion of what we think is possible. Mozi believed that heaven, the moral structure of the universe itself, demands impartial love and collective welfare. Whether you believe in heaven or not, whether you accept his metaphysics or not, the ethical challenge remains: can we build a world where everyone matters equally? Where compassion extends to all humanity? Where we organize society to promote collective flourishing rather than factional advantage? Mozi thought we could. He spent his life trying to prove it. The question is, what do we think? And more importantly, what are we going to do about it? That's the challenge. That's the invitation. That's why Mozi matters. Not because he has all the answers, but because he asked the right questions. And those questions are still waiting for our response.